She was 49 years old when she died, and for 11 years before that, she lived behind a face that had belonged to someone else. Not a metaphor, not a figure of speech. An actual nose, actual lips, an actual chin, lifted from a woman who had died, and sewn onto a living stranger in an operating room in northern France. In November 2005, surgeons did something that no one had ever attempted on a living human being. They performed the world's first partial face transplant, and the woman who agreed to it became, almost overnight, one of the most famous patients in the history of medicine. Her name was Isabelle Denoyer. This is her story, told as accurately as the record allows, and it is stranger and more painful than most people remember that in the spring of 2005, Isabelle Denoyer was 38 years old, living in Valenciennes, a city in the far north of France. She was a divorced mother of 2 children. By every account, she was leading the kind of unremarkable life that never makes the news. And then, in May of that year, everything changed in a matter of moments. While she was unconscious after taking sleeping pills, her own pet Labrador attacked her face. The injuries were catastrophic. Her nose, her lips, and her chin were destroyed. The central structure that allows a human being to eat, to speak clearly, and to breathe through the nose was simply gone. She survived the attack, but survival came with a brutal new reality. She could not eat normally. She could not speak without distortion. She could not close her mouth completely. Every part of daily life that depends on a functioning face had been taken from her in an instant, and there was no simple fix waiting for her at the hospital. Surgeons examined her and reached for the standard toolkit of reconstructive surgery, the kind that has helped burn victims and accident survivors for decades. That approach typically involves taking skin, muscle, or bone from elsewhere on a patient's own body and gradually rebuilding damaged tissue, often across many operations. For many facial injuries, this method works well. But Denoyer's injury was different. The destruction was too central and too complete. There was no way to fold skin from her own thigh or forearm into something that could function as a nose with working nostrils, or lips that could form words and expressions. Conventional reconstruction, the doctors concluded, could not give her a normal-looking, normal-functioning face. That left one other option, one that had never been tried on a living patient anywhere in the world. 2 French surgeons, Bernard Dvorchel and Jean-Michel Dubernard, proposed something radical, a face transplant. Not skin grafted from her own body, but living tissue, the nose, lips, and chin, taken from a brain-dead donor and transplanted directly onto her. Dubernard was no stranger to groundbreaking and controversial transplant surgery. Years earlier he had been part of the team behind the world's first hand transplant, and he understood firsthand how aggressively the human body can reject tissue that isn't its own. The idea split the medical and ethical world. A kidney or a heart transplant changes what's inside a person, invisible to everyone but their doctors. A face is different. It's the part of a human being that the rest of the world actually sees, the part tied most directly to identity. Critics worried the surgery was being rushed for the sake of being first, and that no one could predict the psychological toll of looking in the mirror every day at a face that belonged, in part, to someone who had died. Others argued the opposite, that leaving a woman trapped behind a destroyed face, when a possible solution existed, was its own form of cruelty. In the middle of that debate sat Denoyer herself, struggling to speak clearly enough to weigh in on the conversation about her own life. Doctors were direct with her about the risks. The procedure had never been performed on a person before. If her body rejected the donor tissue, the transplant could fail outright, leaving her in worse condition than before. To prevent rejection, she would need to take powerful immunosuppressant drugs every day for the rest of her life, medication that would leave her more vulnerable to infections and, over time, raise her risk of cancer. There was no reversing the decision once it was made. Despite all of that, she agreed to go forward. On the 27th of November, 2005, at a hospital in Amiens, the surgery began. It lasted around 15 hours. The donor was a woman who had died and whose family consented to donate facial tissue, an extraordinarily difficult decision made in the rawest hours of grief. Surgeons recovered a triangular section of tissue containing the nose, lips, and chin, along with the blood vessels and nerves needed to keep that tissue alive and, eventually, functional. They then worked to connect that donor tissue to Denoyer, joining artery to artery and vein to vein so blood could flow into the graft, and attempting to align nerves in the hope that sensation and movement might eventually return. The surgery worked. The donor tissue took. Blood flowed into it, Color returned, and for the first time in recorded medical history, a person was living with a transplanted nose, lips, and chin. In the weeks that followed, swelling went down and a face began to emerge, not a perfect copy of her old one, and not the donor's face either, but something new, something that could function. She regained some ability to eat normally. She began to form words with lips that could move again. The world reacted exactly the way you'd expect. Dinoia became an instant medical phenomenon, mentioned in the same breath as other historic firsts in medicine. And rather than disappearing from public view, she did something many people in her position might not have had the nerve to do. In February 2006, a few months after the operation, she held a press conference and let the world's cameras look directly at her new face. Reporters described her speech as still somewhat slurred, with a visible scar, but she was able to tell them that she now had, in her words, a face like everyone else. A year later, she would say something that captured the strange new reality she lived in, that it might be someone else's face. But when she looked in the mirror, she saw herself. That public courage is worth sitting with for a moment. This was a woman who, only months earlier, could barely tolerate being looked at by strangers. And here she was, choosing to let the entire planet examine the most photographed face in modern medicine. But the cameras and headlines did what they always do. They moved on. What they didn't follow her into was the actual decade she had ahead of her. The day-to-day reality of being the very first person to ever live with a transplanted face. That a face transplant is not something a person receives once and then simply gets on with their life. It is an ongoing negotiation between two immune systems that were never designed to share a body. Every day, for the rest of her life, Dinoia had to take immunosuppressant medication, drugs that essentially told her immune system to stand down and tolerate tissue it would otherwise identify as foreign and attack. Even with those drugs, her body never fully made peace with the graft. Over the years, she experienced episodes of rejection, periods where her immune system pushed back against the donor tissue, requiring medical intervention to bring it back under control. According to French media reports at the time of her death, she suffered a significant rejection episode roughly a year before she died and lost part of the function of her transplanted lips as a result. There was also a quieter, slower loss running underneath all of this. The nerve connections that surgeons had worked so carefully to re-establish never fully restored everything doctors had hoped for. Sensation and movement in parts of the transplanted tissue gradually diminished over the years, a reminder that even a successful graft has limits the body imposes on its own. And underneath everything sat the cost that had been explained to her from the very beginning. The same drugs keeping her face alive were steadily raising her risk of cancer. That is the basic, unforgiving math of long-term immune suppression. Reduce the body's defenses enough to protect a graft, and you also reduce its ability to catch and destroy cells that shouldn't be there. She knew this risk when she agreed to the surgery, knowing a price in advance and actually living through the process of paying it. Though, are two very different experiences, and she was the first human being who ever had to find that out. She also gave the world something it had never had before, a first-hand account of what it actually feels like to live behind a transplanted face. It's hard to overstate how strange that experience must have been. A face is arguably the most personal thing a person has, and hers had become, quite literally, a collaboration between her own bone and muscle and another woman's nose, lips, and chin. She spoke about the in-between feeling of it, the sense that the person looking back in the mirror each morning wasn't quite the woman she had been before the attack, and wasn't the donor either, but someone new entirely, shaped by an operation no one had a name for before her. While she navigated all of that privately, surgeons around the world were paying close attention to every part of her case, every episode of rejection, every medication adjustment, every report on what worked and what didn't. She became, without necessarily choosing the role, the proof of concept the entire field of transplant surgery had been waiting for. Within a few years, other surgical teams in other countries began performing their own face transplants, face partial ones similar to hers, and eventually full face transplants. These procedures went on to help burn victims, accident survivors, and people disfigured by violence or disease, in places including the United States, Spain, China, Belgium, Poland, and Turkey. By the time of her death, doctors estimated that nearly 40 face transplant surgeries had been performed worldwide since her operation in 2005. Every one of those patients who could eat a meal with their family again, or walk into a room without people staring, owed something to the woman in Amiens who agreed to go first. The price she had been warned about eventually came due. After more than a decade on immunosuppressant drugs, Dino I had developed cancer. The long-term risk her doctors had named for her from the very start. French reports at the time of her death indicated she had developed 2 cancers linked to the medication she'd taken for years to protect the transplant. On the 22nd of April, 2016, she died at the hospital in Amiens, the same hospital where her transplant had been performed more than a decade earlier. She was 49 years old. In keeping with her family's wishes, her death wasn't made public right away. The hospital didn't release the news until early September, nearly 5 months later, citing the family's desire to protect their privacy during such a painful time. For those months, the most famous transplanted face in medical history had quietly left the world, and almost no one outside her immediate circle knew it. What she left behind extends well beyond her own life. She left behind a procedure that, because of her, was no longer purely theoretical. She left behind a generation of surgeons who studied her case and carried what they learned into operating rooms around the world. And she left behind every person who has since received a new face after an accident, an illness, or violence, and gotten a piece of their life back because of it. A face transplant went from a question debated in ethics committees to an actual medical option, in large part because one woman in Amiens, faced with an impossible situation, chose to say yes to the unknown. She was the first, which meant she absorbed risks no one could fully calculate in advance. The rejection episodes, the slow loss of sensation, the cancer that eventually took her life, and a decade spent looking at a face in the mirror that was never entirely her own and never entirely someone else's either. She carried that uncertainty so that the patients who came after her wouldn't have to face it as blindly. So here's the question worth sitting with. If your face were destroyed beyond what conventional surgery could repair, and the only path back to looking and functioning like a human being again meant accepting part of a stranger's face as your own for the rest of your life, would you do it? Would the chance to be seen by the world again be worth the daily uncertainty of wearing features that were once someone else's? Isabel Dinoia said yes, fully aware of what she was risking, and medicine moved forward because she did. If her story affected you, consider sharing it, because she spent 11 years living through something no one before her had ever had to face, and she deserves to be remembered for exactly what that took.